The auctioneer raised his gavel. Going once. Going twice. 80-year-old farmer Walter Hayes stood silently at the edge of the crowd as strangers bid on the land his family had owned for nearly a century. The red barn where he had played as a child. The farmhouse where he had buried his wife. The fields he had worked every day for 57 years. All of it was about to belong to someone else. Walter's hands trembled as the final bid echoed across the county courthouse lawn. And then something happened that nobody expected. A young court clerk made a tiny mistake. A mistake so small that most people wouldn't have noticed it. But that mistake would expose a truth powerful enough to stop the auction, shock the entire town, and change Walter's life forever. The town of Millfield sat between rolling hills and endless farmland. Most people knew Walter Hayes. He wasn't rich. He wasn't famous. But he was respected. Every morning before sunrise, Walter drove his old pickup truck through the same dirt roads he'd traveled for decades. His wife, Margaret, had passed away 5 years earlier after a long illness. The medical bills had drained nearly all their savings. Still, Walter never complained. He simply worked harder. Unfortunately, farming had become difficult. A severe drought ruined crops for 2 seasons. Equipment repairs piled up. Fuel costs increased. And little by little, debt began to consume the farm. The local bank had given him extensions. Then more extensions. Eventually they stopped. One cold February morning, Walter opened a certified letter. His stomach dropped. Foreclosure. The bank would seize the property and sell it at public auction. Walter sat alone at his kitchen table for hours staring at the letter. Everything he had spent a lifetime building was disappearing. News spread quickly through town. Many residents felt sorry for Walter. But sympathy couldn't pay debts. The auction date was set for April 18th. As the day approached, buyers from neighboring counties became interested. The Hayes farm sat on valuable land. Developers saw opportunity. Investors saw profit. Walter saw memories. The night before the auction, he walked through the empty barn. Dust floated through shafts of moonlight. He ran his hand across old wooden beams his father had installed decades earlier. In one corner stood faded marks showing how tall his children had grown over the years. Walter swallowed hard. Tomorrow strangers would own it all. Auction day arrived. More than 100 people gathered outside the courthouse. Several developers came prepared to bid aggressively. Local residents watched quietly. Many hoped for a miracle. Walter knew miracles rarely happened. At exactly 10 o'clock, the auction began. The bidding climbed quickly. 100,000. 150,000. 200,000. 250,000. Walter stopped listening. The numbers no longer mattered. The farm was gone. Finally, a wealthy developer named Richard Coleman submitted the highest bid. The crowd murmured. Everyone knew Coleman. He had purchased several farms nearby and replaced them with commercial projects. The auctioneer lifted the gavel. Sold. The sound echoed through the courtyard. Walter lowered his head. It was over. Or so everyone thought. Inside the courthouse, paperwork processing began. A 26-year-old court clerk named Emily Parker was responsible for verifying transaction documents. Emily had only worked there for 8 months. She was careful and organized. As she reviewed foreclosure records, something felt strange. One document listed the foreclosure case number. Another listed the property description. A third listed debt calculations. The numbers didn't match. At first she assumed it was a simple filing issue. But the more she checked, the stranger it became. Emily frowned. Then she looked again. And again. Her heart began racing. One of the legal descriptions attached to Walter's foreclosure file belonged to an entirely different property. A property located nearly 20 miles away. That shouldn't have been possible. Emily immediately brought the documents to her supervisor. The supervisor glanced briefly and shrugged. Probably a clerical error. But it's attached to the foreclosure order, Emily replied. So, if the wrong property description was filed, the foreclosure may not be legally valid. The supervisor finally looked up. Silence filled the office. Now he understood. A foreclosure order depends on precise legal identification. If critical documents contain incorrect property information, the entire process can become legally questionable. Emily continued reviewing records. What she discovered next was even worse. Months earlier, during a document transfer, multiple files had been merged incorrectly. The error wasn't recent. It had existed throughout the legal proceedings. Nobody had caught it. Not the attorneys. Not the bank. Not the court administrators. Nobody. Within hours, emergency calls began. The county judge was notified. The auction transfer was paused. Richard Coleman was furious. His lawyers demanded immediate clarification. Walter had no idea what was happening. A deputy approached him before he left town. "Mr. Hayes, the judge needs you back inside." Walter looked confused. "Why?" "There's a problem with the paperwork." For the first time that day, Walter felt a small spark of hope. The hearing took place the following morning. The courtroom was packed. Residents filled every seat. Emily sat nervously near the back. The judge carefully reviewed evidence. Lawyers argued for hours. Bank representatives insisted the debt was legitimate. Walter's attorney agreed the debt existed. But legality matters. Procedures matter. Accuracy matters. The judge eventually delivered his decision. Because the foreclosure filing contained significant errors affecting property identification, the completed auction could not legally stand. Gasps filled the courtroom. The sale was voided. Immediately. Walter's farm would not transfer ownership. At least not yet. Tears formed in Walter's eyes. For the first time in months, he walked out of the courthouse still owning his land. But the story didn't end there. The publicity surrounding the case spread rapidly. Local newspapers covered the dramatic courtroom ruling. Television stations picked up the story. People across the state learned about the elderly farmer who nearly lost everything because of bureaucratic mistakes. Then something remarkable happened. The town decided it wasn't enough to celebrate. They wanted to help. A local teacher organized a fundraiser. Church groups joined. Business owners donated. Former students Walter had coached decades earlier contributed money. Even people who had never met him sent donations. Within weeks, thousands of dollars poured in. Then tens of thousands. The support stunned everyone. Especially Walter. One afternoon he sat reading handwritten letters from strangers. Many shared stories about family farms. Others thanked him for representing hard-working people who often felt forgotten. Walter carefully saved every letter. Each one reminded him he wasn't alone. Meanwhile, the bank faced growing public scrutiny. Executives reviewed the case internally. The negative attention became impossible to ignore. Eventually bank representatives requested a meeting with Walter. He expected another legal discussion. Instead, they surprised him. Recognizing both procedural failures and extraordinary community circumstances, the bank offered a significantly revised repayment arrangement. Interest penalties were reduced. Deadlines were extended. The debt became manageable. Walter accepted. For the first time in years, a path forward existed. Several months later, harvest season arrived. Golden fields stretched toward the horizon. Walter stood beside his tractor watching volunteers help bring in crops. Neighbors worked side by side. Teenagers loaded equipment. Retired farmers offered advice. The farm was alive again. Emily Parker visited one afternoon. Walter greeted her warmly. "I've been wanting to thank you." Emily smiled. "I was just doing my job." "No," Walter replied softly. "You were doing it right." She laughed. Maybe that was true. Most people had overlooked the details. She hadn't. A single careful review changed everything. As the sun began setting, Walter looked across the fields. The land remained in his family. The barn still stood. The farmhouse still held memories. And hope had returned. Not because of luck. Not because of wealth. But because one young clerk refused to ignore a mistake. Sometimes life changes through grand heroic actions. And sometimes it changes because someone takes an extra moment to look closely at a piece of paper. A tiny error nearly cost Walter Hayes everything. Yet that same error revealed the truth. And in the end, the truth saved the farm. The crowd remembered the auction. The town remembered the battle. But Walter remembered something simpler. One person cared enough to pay attention. And that made all the difference.